Okay. Tell me what's the difference between Kings and Chronicles? Say what?
I said, did you say Kings and Chronicles?
Mm-hmm. The books of First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles. Well, one is both, and one is only. And there's a matter of timing. You will know which was first. Because they cover the same territory. They cover the same time. But which one was written first? And it's a big, big part of why there's two of them, because they cover the same time frame. First and Second Kings were written as the events took place by courtiers that were making notes about what was going on. The recorders, as they're talked about in the scripture. Each king had a group of recorders that would, kind of like a court recorder, that would take down everything that happened, and they took down everything that happened, good, bad, and ugly, and that's the way it was. But what's the difference with Chronicles then? So when was Chronicles written? We're going to talk about that. We're going to look at the outline, the Bible project. But I wanted to see what you guys, how you looked at those two before we look at this outline, because the book of Chronicles tells you things that you're not going to see in the book of Kings. And there's a totally different perspective from Chronicles, because Chronicles is written like 200 years after they come out of Babylonian captivity, and everything is looking forward to the Messiah. So there are going to be a lot of things that are not said in Chronicles that were said in First and Second Kings. For instance, it's going to take a different view of the kings and what they did. If you read about Manasseh in First and Second Kings, you're not going to see anything good about him. But when you read it in Chronicles, it tells a totally different story. It tells the story of how in the last 5 years of his life, he did everything he could to turn it around. You're also not going to read anything that's bad about David in Chronicles. First, in Kings, it's going to tell you everything that happened. It's going to tell you how he was weak at times, how he did sinful things at times. Hi, sugar. Come on in. So let's take a look at that. And I just got a message from Mary Ellen. They're not. She's worried about Becky, so that's why they're not here. That's not what I wanted to do. Okay, let's back up here. See if I can do this.
Bill, did you have a date on Chronicles?
Huh?
A date?
Not exactly, but it's a couple of hundred years after the captivity. So, and the writer is unknown. Writer and timing is kind of unknown. Okay. If you see something you want to talk about, stop it, okay? Holler and we'll stop talking.
the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. While they're two separate books in our Bibles, that division is not original. Due to scroll length, the book was divided in two, but it was written as one book with one coherent storyline. Now, in our English Bibles, Chronicles comes after the books of Samuel and Kings, and most of Chronicles is actually repeat content from those books. And so most modern readers, when they come to Chronicles, they think, wait a minute, I just read all of this, and so they skip it. And that's a shame, because this book is really unique and important in the Bible. In the traditional Jewish ordering of the Bible, Chronicles is actually the last book because it summarizes all of the Jewish scriptures. The first word in the book is Adam, the first character at the beginning of the story, and then the last paragraph announces the return of Israel from exile. Now, we don't know who wrote this book, but we can tell from details within it, it was produced by somebody who lived a couple hundred years after the Israelites returned from the Babylonian exile. Now, for this author, Jerusalem and the temple were rebuilt some time ago, and as we learned from Ezra and Nehemiah, things were not going well. The great prophetic hope was that the city and the temple would be rebuilt, that God would come to live among his people, the Messianic king would come, and all the nations would come live under his peaceful rule, and none of that has happened. And so the author of Chronicles has reshaped these stories of David and Solomon and the kings of the past in order to provide a message of hope for the future. And we'll see that he's designed this book to emphasize two clear themes. First, the hope of the coming Messianic king, and second, the hope for a new temple. Let's just dive in and you'll see these themes all over the book. First Chronicles begins with 9 chapters of genealogies, long lists of names. And you'll read these and think that this is kind of boring, and that
You guys want to stop and go through the 9 chapters of genealogies? But I'll tell you what, he is right. They are important. And listen to why he says they're important. Because there are lists of genealogies and they're almost never given for no reason. There's always a purpose in telling you how you got from there to there. And the people involved in it are always important.
may be true for you, but actually they're very, very important. The author is summarizing here the whole storyline of the Old Testament by naming all of the key characters in the stories. And as he does so, he shapes the genealogies to emphasize 2 key lineages. First is the line of the promised Messianic king. So lots of space is dedicated to tracing the line of Judah that led all the way to King David, to whom the Messianic promise was given. And then from David, the author traces that line up into his own day. The other family line that receives lots of attention here is that of the priesthood, the descendants of Aaron, who, of course, served in the temple. And so right from the start, you can see the 2 main themes, the author's hope of the Messiah coming to build a new temple, and it's rooted in these ancient genealogies. Now, after that, the author moves into the stories about David, and most of these are going to be familiar to you from the book of Samuel, but again, there's some really important differences. So first of all, the author leaves out all of the negative stories about David, where he's portrayed as weak or immoral. So Saul chasing David around the desert and persecuting him, the story of David's adultery with Bathsheba and then murdering her husband, all of that is gone. And what's left are the stories that portray David as a good guy. And not only that, there's also new additional material that you won't find in the book of Samuel that shows David in a very positive light. So there's a large block of chapters where David makes preparations for the temple. He arranges resources and builders and Levites and choirs. And not only that, the author also portrays David as a Moses-like figure. God gives David plans for building the temple just as he gave plans to Moses for building the tabernacle. So why all this new material about David? The author's not trying to hide David's flaws. He knows that anybody can go read about them in the book of Samuel. Rather, he's trying to portray David as the ideal king in order to make him an image or a type of the future Messiah from the line of David. It's very similar to how Jeremiah or Ezekiel spoke of the coming Messiah as a new David. This is most clear in how the author retells the story of God's covenant promise to David in 1.
Have you noticed as you read in these books how it will define a king by whether he lived like David lived? Now you'll find that especially in Chronicles, because the whole point is that we're looking for a new David. And that's what all of the prophets would turn to, what they would talk about, is looking for a king like David.
Chronicles 17. When you compare this story with its parallel in 2 Samuel 7, you'll see that the author of Chronicles is highlighting that neither David, nor Solomon, nor any of the kings from his line were the Messianic king, and that when the Messiah does come, he will be a king like David. And so for this author, these stories about David from the past are what sustain his hope for the future. After David dies, we move into 2 Chronicles, which focuses on the kings that lived in Jerusalem. And again, there's lots of overlap with 1st and 2nd Kings, but there are many key differences. So the author has left out all of the stories about the kings of northern Israel, so he can just focus on the line of David. And there's lots of new material about these kings from David's line. He highlights the kings that were obedient to God, and he adds new stories about how their obedience led to success and God's blessing. But he also adds new stories about kings who were unfaithful to God. They didn't follow the Torah, they led Israel to worship idols, and these kings face horrible consequences, all leading up to Israel's exile, a mess of their own making. And so this whole section becomes a series of character studies where the author wants later generations of Israelites to learn from their family history, and so become faithful to their God and the Torah. Now, the book's conclusion is really unique too. At the very end of the book, the king of the Persians, his name's Cyrus, and he tells the Israelites that they can go back home, return from exile, rebuild the city and the temple. And he says, last line of the book, "Whoever there is among you, of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up." And that's how the book ends, with an incomplete sentence. Now, of course, the author knows about the first return from exile and the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, but clearly in his view, the prophetic hopes of Israel were not fulfilled in those events. And so this incomplete ending shows that the author's hope is set on yet another return from exile, when the Messiah will finally come to rebuild the temple and restore God's people. And so the book of Chronicles, it's the final book of the Jewish scriptures. It ends by pointing forward. It calls God's people to look back in order to look ahead, because the past has become the source of hope for the future. So Chronicles concludes the Old Testament as a story in search of an ending, and that's what this book is all about.
I've often noted
There's a good reason, number 45.
You lost a lot of weight.
Look the same though. Okay, let's do away with that somehow here. I don't even know how to do it.
Is the best of all time. Because we can always trust them to tell it like it is.
Oh, okay, that'll do. That's innocuous right there. Okay, we can handle it. I wanted to go from Chronicles. We're not. I don't want to go back and go through First and Second Chronicles, because that would be way too time consuming. But getting that outline right there to give us an idea of why there's two that repeat the same stories is kind of like the Gospels. They're the same, but they're not the same. They tell the same story perhaps, but from a different perspective. The perspective of the writers of Chronicles they don't want to enhance the disappointment that people felt in the new temple that didn't even come close to matching the old one. They were trying to emphasize the positive part of the new Messiah, the one that they were looking for, the one that would correct all the problems of the world. And so far, every prophet has failed to bring that Messiah to bear. They talk about him, but it hasn't happened yet. So that's why that book ends the way it ends. During that period of time, about the time, actually a little bit before the time of the writing of the Chronicles, we have the story of Esther. What's special about that book that you know? It's really different. Really different, huh? God is not mentioned one time. How can that be? A book in the Bible about God that doesn't mention God one time. What do you think could be the purpose in that? Why do we have a book like that? Is God absent from the book of Esther? You're shaking your head no. How can God not be absent when he's not in the book? It doesn't say that. Okay. But God is never mentioned. But how do we see God in that book? I want to go to that now, and we'll watch the thing about Esther, because he does a good job on this about Esther. If I can get to that without going through a lot of nonsense here.
Australia is now preparing for war in order to avoid it. Their historic new increase in defense spending and China's dependence on them for iron ore make them an important ally. Australia's defense funding for 2024 will be $35 billion, just over 2% of their GDP.
Thank you, buddy. You know, it's terrible to be as old as I am and scared of something like this. It just scares me to death. All right. The book of Esther.
The book of Esther. It's one of the more exciting and curious books in the Bible. The story is set over 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from their land. And while some Jews did return to Jerusalem, remember Ezra and Nehemiah, many did not. And so the book of Esther is about a Jewish community living in Susa, the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire. And the main characters in this story are two Jews, Mordecai and then his niece Esther. And then there's the king of Persia, who's something of a drunken pushover in this story. And then there's the Persian official Haman, the cunning villain. Now, this is a curious book in the Bible, mainly for the fact that God is never even mentioned, not once, which might strike you as kind of odd. I mean, isn't the Bible about God? But this is a brilliant technique by the author, who's anonymous, by the way. It's an invitation to read this story looking for God's activity, and there are signs of it everywhere. The story is full of very odd, quote, coincidences and ironic reversals, and it all forces you to see God's purpose at work, but behind the scenes. Let's just dive into the story. The book opens with the king of Persia throwing two elaborate banquet feasts that last a total of 187 days, and it's all for the grandiose purpose of displaying his greatness and splendor. On the last day of the banquet feast, he's really drunk, and he demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty. She refuses, and so in a drunken rage, the king deposes Vashti and makes the silly decree that all Persian men should now be the masters of their own homes. Then he holds a beauty pageant because he wants to find a new queen. This is like a really bad soap opera. But it's right here that we're introduced to Esther and Mordecai. Esther hides her Jewish identity and enters the beauty pageant and wins. And the king is so obsessed with Esther that he elevates her to become the new queen of Persia. Now, after this, and even more serendipitous, is the fact that Mordecai just happens to overhear two royal guards plotting to murder the king.
Just happens. How many coinkydinks can you count that you have no explanation for? It makes you wonder how many of these things are directly initiated by God's forces.
Mordecai, how are they related?
He's her uncle. Actually, his uncle was her dad. So he's her, what do you call that? The second uncle. A second uncle? Yeah, whatever that is.
So he informs Esther, who in turn informs the king, and Mordecai gets credit for saving the king's life. Now, right here from the beginning, God's not mentioned anywhere, but this all seems providentially ordered. What is it that God's up to? You have to keep reading. We're next introduced to Haman, who's not actually a Persian. He's called an Agagite. He's a descendant of the ancient Canaanites. Remember?
Do you remember King Agag? This is him generations later, okay?
1 Samuel chapter 15. The king elevates Haman to the highest position in the kingdom, and he demands that everybody kneel before Haman. Well, when Mordecai sees Haman, he refuses to kneel, which of course fills Haman with rage. And when he finds out that Mordecai's Jewish, Haman successfully persuades the king to enact this crazy decree to destroy all of the Jewish people. And to decide the date of the Jews' annihilation, Haman rolls the dice. A die is called pur in Hebrew. Tuck that away for later. 11 months later, on the 13th of Adar, all the Jews will die. Haman and the king then have a drinking banquet to celebrate their really horrible decision. So the focus now turns to Mordecai and Esther, who are the only hope for the Jewish people. They make a plan that Esther's going to reveal her Jewish identity to the king and ask him to reverse the decree. But approaching the king without a royal request is, according to Persian law, an act worthy of death. So in a key statement, Mordecai, he's confident that even if Esther remains silent, that deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place. And then Mordecai wonders,
why is Mordecai saying that right there? Even if you don't go before the king, deliverance will come from somewhere. Yeah, but why is he saying that? Because she's he doesn't want her to get killed. And that's very likely what's going to happen if she defies the king. Look what happened to Vashti. So he's really concerned about this, and he's trying to save her by saying, something will happen, we'll be all right.
Loud, he says, who knows? Maybe you've become queen for this very moment. Esther responds with bravery, and she purposes to go to the king with her amazing words, if I perish, I perish. Now, in what unfolds, we watch the ironic reversal of all of Haman's evil plans. So Esther hosts the king and Haman at a first banquet, and she says that she wants to make a special request of both of them at an exclusive banquet the following day. So Haman leaves the banquet totally drunk, and he sees Mordecai in the street. He fumes with anger, and he orders that a tall stake be built so that Mordecai can be impaled upon it in the morning. It seems like things can't get any worse for the Jews and for Mordecai. But all of a sudden, the story pivots. It just so happens that night, the king, he can't sleep, and he has the royal chronicles read to him for good bedtime reading, and he just happens to hear about how Mordecai had saved the king's life. He had totally forgotten. So in the morning, Haman enters to request Mordecai's execution, and the king in that moment orders Haman to honor Mordecai publicly for saving his life. So now Haman has to lead Mordecai around the city on a royal horse, telling everyone to praise him. Now this moment in the story, it's a pivot for the whole book. It begins Haman's downfall and Mordecai's rise to power. Watch how this works. The day after is Esther's second banquet. So the king and Haman arrive, and Esther informs the king that first of all, she's Jewish, and second, that Haman has enacted a decree to murder her and to murder Mordecai, who saved his life, and to murder all of the Jews. Now the king's had a lot to drink, so when he hears this news, he goes into yet one more drunken rage, and he orders that Haman be impaled on the very stake he made from.
What's wrong with that picture? Huh? I wonder why he did this. because they learned this from the Assyrians. It was Ashurbanipal that invented this impalement, and it was the first form of crucifixion. And from the time that the Assyrians did this, it was used by every kingdom after that, but developed to where the people would last longer and suffer more. And that's why the Romans nailed them to the post instead of impaling them. What the picture should be up here is they would hold a person up and they would drive them down, holding their legs, and pull them down on that stake. And they would wiggle and writhe in pain until they didn't, but it didn't last long enough because they wanted that to be an impression on everybody who thought about rebelling. So, it's...
So, Darryl, why do some versions say gallows?
Yeah,
It paints a totally different picture.
it sure does, doesn't it?
Thinking of those two.
The first two were hung on gallows, but then they transfer that to this. Anybody got the word? Look up what gallows is in the word, literal word.
In the ESV, there's a footnote that says "or stake."
Yeah, yeah. And that was typical. The stake was typical.
Mordecai. It's ironic and a grisly way for Haman to go. Haman's execution, however, doesn't solve the problem of the decree to kill all of the Jews. So the focus now turns to Esther and Mordecai as they make a plan to reverse the decree. They discover that the king can't revoke a decree that he's already made. So instead, the king commissions Mordecai to issue a counter-decree. On the appointed day that all of the Jews were supposed to be killed, the 13th of Adar, now the Jews are ordered to defend themselves and to destroy any who plotted to kill them. Then Mordecai, Esther, and Jews everywhere hold banquets and feasts to celebrate this new decree, and Mordecai is elevated to a seat beside the king. Eventually, the decreed day comes, and the Jews triumph over their enemies. First, they destroy Haman's family, and then any other Persian officials who had joined in Haman's plot. And then on a second day, they get permission to destroy any who plotted against them throughout the entire kingdom. This results in joy and celebration as the Jews are rescued from annihilation. The story then tells about how Esther and Mordecai established by decree this annual 2-day feast of Purim to commemorate their deliverance from destruction. And the name of the feast comes from Haman's dice. Remember? Purim. The book concludes with a short epilogue as Mordecai is elevated to second in command in the kingdom, and we are told now of his royal greatness and splendor as the Jews thrive in exile. Now, step back. Notice how this whole story has been designed. The story was full of moments of ironic reversal, but we can now see the whole story is structured as an ironic reversal, right down to the details. So the king's splendor and feasts and decrees are mirrored by Mordecai's splendor and feasts and decrees at the end. Esther and Mordecai, they first saved the king, but now in the end they save all of the Jews. Then you have Haman's elevation and edicts and banquet that gets reversed by Mordecai's elevation and edict and banquet. And then at the center you have Esther and Mordecai's planning scenes, and then Esther's 2 banquets that act as a frame around the greatest moment of reversal in the whole story: Haman's humiliation and Mordecai's exaltation. Beautiful. Another fascinating feature of this book is the moral ambiguity of the characters. There's a lot of drinking and anger and sex and murder, of which Mordecai and Esther are a part. Not to mention their violation of many commands in the Torah, like marrying Gentiles or eating impure foods. And so the story's not putting Mordecai and Esther forward as moral example, as if it endorses all of their behavior. But they are put forward as models of trust and hope when things get really bad. And so the book of Esther,
having read the book of Esther, can you see anything that she did that violated food? I mean, in Daniel, why did Daniel and his friends not eat and drink what the king put forward? Huh?
Violated what they thought they were allowed to eat, right? And and the health aspects of it.
What foods would they not eat? Said they ate vegetables. Why were vegetables from the king okay, but meat wasn't? Because they never sacrificed the vegetables to the king or to the idols. It was always meat. That's why Paul said what he said in 1 Corinthians. It's when something is openly offered to a pagan god that they wouldn't do it. If Paul says if nobody knows about it, eat it. Just eat it. Don't ask questions, because it means nothing that it was offered to those gods unless it's going to cause somebody to go think you are supporting that. So it's the same thing with Daniel and the food and drink. It wasn't because of it being evil. It was because it was offered to something evil and they didn't want to support that. So.
Darryl, did they not have the different things that they were not allowed to eat?
Oh yeah, yeah.
When Paul was,
And that would be the same case. I mean,
so it could have been both or one or the other.
yeah. Of course, the Persians and the Babylonians had no problem with eating piggies, and the Jews, they couldn't do that. So there were things that they couldn't eat, and that would be included in that. But the biggest thing was the food was offered to an idol.
Here comes back to that question with which we began, why God is not mentioned. The message of this book seems to be that when God seems absent, when his people are in exile, when they're unfaithful to the Torah, does this mean that God is done with Israel? Has God abandoned his promises? And the book of Esther says no. It invites us to see that God can and does work in the real mess and moral ambiguity of human history, and he uses the faithfulness of even morally compromised people to accomplish his purposes. And so the book of Esther asks us to be willing to trust God's providence even when we can't see it working, and to hope that no matter how bad things get, God is committed to redeeming his world. And that's what the book of Esther is all about.
Morally compromised people. Tell me about the judges. Let's just think about how the judges fit into this. Who would you ask to be a judge? What does that word mean anyway? Judge. What were those judges that they had? They had 15 judges over a period of 350 years. What were they? They weren't people that sat on a bench and made decisions between people, were they? So the name judges is kind of difficult for us when we look at it from a standpoint of English. They weren't jurists. They were right. Huh? Leaders, vindicators is the best word, I think, for that, because they would save God's people for God from situations that they got themselves into. So there were 7 complete cycles of good and evil in that 350 years of the judges. And it was people that were called out to deliver them that sometimes were morally compromised. Can you think of one or two or 9? Who would you say was the king of the morally compromised? Samson? Yeah, I can think of a few things Samson did and what was, the name just flew. The guy that offered didn't offer his daughter, but he offered the first thing that comes out of my house, I will offer in sacrifice. Okay. Now there were some good ones too, though, like Gideon. Gideon was staunch servant of the Lord. But it didn't have to be, because God sometimes uses people that you wouldn't think. Cyrus, for instance. Here's a Persian king. We're talking about Persian kings here. You can tell there probably wasn't a whole lot of difference in Cyrus and Ahasuerus, because when you have all that kind of power, and what is that? I'm dinging my sound thing. I forgot what I was saying. It's interesting, though, when you start looking at the character of people that God uses. And he refers to, in Jeremiah, uses Cyrus as my servant. That's what God referred to him as. So there are a lot of times when God uses people that are not the morally best to accomplish his purposes.
Even Nebuchadnezzar, I mean, he had his time. Your king.
Yeah.
Listen to their king.
That reading about Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel, I don't know, but what he ended his life believing in God. But his son was a totally different story. You know, his son was, but do we have examples of that with the Israelite kings? That the father will be a real good king like Hezekiah, and then we wind up with Manasseh next. And he's a totally bad one until he turns out to be a good one in the last 5 years. So there are so many examples of this that God uses everybody, and doesn't have to be a good person for God to use them.
Isn't he still using us that way?
Yeah. I don't think anything like that changes over time. You know, it's always a part of God's tool bag, you know, to use what he wants. I would like...
The book of Daniel. The story set...
Thank you, whoever did that. Let's go to the book of Esther. I would like to read that first chapter because it sets the stage for a lot of conversation. Oh, wrong end of the... Now it took place in the days of Ahasuerus. The Ahasuerus reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his throne, which was at the citadel in Susa, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his princes and attendants, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of his provinces being in his presence. And he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. Can you imagine a banquet that lasts for 6 months? Yikes. This is opulent decadence here at its finest or worstest, whichever way you want to look at that. When these days were completed, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days. Okay, we got to do another one now. Did you notice in that outline how many banquets there were that set the stage for what was taking place? King gave a banquet lasting 7 days for all the people who were present at the citadel in Susa, from the greatest to the least, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. And it describes what was there, the again, opulence that there was in the court of the king of Persia. And it says drinks were served in golden vessels of various kinds. I wonder, you know, the demise of the Babylonians, the night that they were done away with, what were they doing? Yeah, They were drinking from golden vessels that came out of the temple. Now those have all gone back, but it kind of shows you the mentality of people who live drunken lives. They got to show their wealth and their majesty. The drinking was done according to the law, and there was no compulsion. For so the king had given orders to each official of his household that he should do according to the desires of each person. So they weren't making people get drunk. They were going to allow people to drink or not drink, and that's kind of a nice thing, that you don't have to go and match the swallows with someone who is. That is that they weren't forced to. I take that's what it means, that everybody did according to his own conscience with this drinking. Yeah. So, Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the palace which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, what does that mean? He's drunk as a skunk. He's slobbering all over himself. He commanded Mehuman and these other guys, I'm not even going to try and read them, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus. Notice how that number keeps popping up even in situations that don't involve God's people. That number 7 was a number that held a lot of importance. Of course, it had the same origin no matter who you were. It said they were to bring Queen Vashti before the king with a royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and to the princes, for she was beautiful. When you've got every woman in the kingdom to choose from, you don't choose mutts. You just don't. And it's kind of interesting that nationality doesn't determine beauty. What nationality were the Jews? What ethnicity were the Jews? Huh? When you see a Jew on TV today, what ethnicity do you see? Huh? What? Caucasian. Yeah. What were the early Jews? Huh? They were Asian, Oriental. They came from Shem. Shem is the father of all of the Eastern nations. What's happened in the last 2,000 years that Jews now look European and not Asian? I can just about guarantee you that if a DNA test was done on modern day Jews, not an extremely small portion of them would have any genetic connection to Abraham whatsoever. Because most Jews today are what were called Ashkenazi, that were converted to Judaism back about 1,000 years after Christ. And they were all Europeans of German extraction, living more in the area of Western Russia. And yet, today, making claims of genetic connection to the land of Israel, makes you go, what's wrong with this picture? Anyway, they are not God's people. They rejected God's people. They rejected the Messiah, even the ones who were genetically connected to Shem, to Moses, to Abraham, rejected the Messiah. And Daniel speaks of the final indignation of those people by being destroyed in the destruction of Jerusalem. And I don't know why people all over the world are still looking for the Jews to be saved when Jesus comes back again. And somebody's going to have to explain that one to me, and I haven't heard a explanation yet. Just
Or in 1948, you give them their own land.
because they genetically owned it?
Well, and they'd
Yeah.
already been given it, hadn't they?
Huh?
They'd already been given it by God in the past. That was
Yeah, but God didn't give it to those people.
No, and he didn't give them that part of what was given to them in 1948. They'd already gotten their land by God long ago, thousands of years before.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And
It wasn't what was given to them in 1948. God had already taken care of that long before.
so there are a lot of things that when the world supports an idea and it becomes so strong in our media that we trust so devotedly, well, why are you shaking your heads no? Because we don't trust them. So why are we following the idea? Why does America follow the ideas that are purported by someone that we don't trust in the first place? These people right here were Oriental. Have y'all ever looked into the different language groups that there are in the world? All of the language of the world is divided into three major groups. There are the what are called the Romance languages, or the Indo-European language group. And India is a part of that, which kind of makes you go, huh? The nation of India, Hindus, are a part of this Indo-European language group. And then you have the Shemitic languages, which Israel was the westernmost of those, and Hebrew part of that, and Aramaic. And then all of the languages that go east, minus India, are a part of that. Chinese and Japanese and Korean, all of those are a part of that language group that we call Shemitic. Do you know when the first time in America that anti-Semitism was talked about? It was a big deal. Any ideas? What was it who would it have been connected with? Jews? Huh? Yeah, why? What was the problem with these people? They were taking all the jobs. This was back during the gold rush and the period when they were building railroads, and the Chinese were coming in, and people were all upset about all these Chinese coming into the country. And it was called anti-Semitism because it's not Semitism, it's Shemitism. It's the descendants of Shem that they object to. So history has a lot of information if we understand what history is talking about. And, well, you do know that reading and listening to history is kind of like listening to one side of a domestic dispute. You know, you're going to get the side of whoever won the fight, and that's the way history is going to be recorded. And then you have the Hamitic languages, which are the languages of Ham that went from Palestine south into Africa, and almost all of those languages are interconnected, but not connected to any of the other two major groups. And that's the thing that really gets you, is that there's no connection between Chinese and German, or German and Swahili, but all of the languages within the group. How many of our words come from English come from Latin or German or Greek? I love dealing with the boys, and I'll send them a message in Italian, and Spanish, or sometimes German. All of our languages all of our Indo-European languages have connections, but not within the other three. It's amazing how that works. Where did that originate? Where did that separation come from? All those three different languages in separate directions. Yeah. Where's that first recorded in the Bible? Genesis what? Babel's in chapter 11, right? Well, where's this separation by families first talked about? Let's go to Genesis chapter 10, which is before Babel, right? But chapter 10 is an interesting chapter because it's giving the generations of these different groups. And the three sons of Noah were Shem, Ham, and Japheth, according to verse 1, okay? Now these are the records of the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, sons of Noah, the sons who were born to them after the flood, and sons that were born to them after the flood. The sons of Japheth were Gomer and Magog and Madai and Javan and Tubal and Meshech and Tiras. The sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz and Riphtah and Togarmah. The sons of Javan, you know what any of these names mean? What countries they are? I know a few. Like Javan is Greece, the coasts and the islands of Greece. And Gomer and Magog are Upper European and Russia and Germanic tribes. And it goes on listing these, but the point that I wanted to get is in verse 5. It says, "From these the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, into their nations." But when did that happen? When were they divided by their languages and their families into these nations? It was after chapter 11. So all of this happens after the Tower of Babel, when God told them to separate, spread over the world, and repopulate the world, and they said, no, we're going to build a tower and take over. And that's when the Tower of Babel actually took place. This is one of the best proofs of the Tower of Babel being a real event that actually took place and did exactly what the Bible says it did. Because why else would a language go from Palestine, which is it's the hub of all of this, it's where everything's separated from. The Shemitic languages go east. The Japhetic languages go north and west. And the Hamitic languages go south and west into Africa. There's no explanation on earth for those languages being interconnected within that one and interconnected here and interconnected over here, but having no connection with each other of the three. So it's amazing how the Bible proves itself to be true by little facts that just kind of go unnoticed. And here in this 10th chapter, we have a beautiful illustration of where nations originated and how they came to be of importance. So, that's about what I've got for tonight. This is so informative if you just soak in it. But you kind of have to soak in it. It's not something that you read it the first time and you go, oh yeah, all right, yeah, that really makes sense. It takes some, doesn't it? Yeah. Huh? I certainly do, dear. Because this is not something that you're going to stumble over. This is going to take keep knocking, ask, keep asking. You know, this is a continuation kind of thing.
Tying pieces together.
Yeah, because the more you read, I've been trying to convince my neighbor that leave the modern day prophecies alone. Read this book and let it make connections for you. God will help you, but he's not going to give you the information without your effort. It takes us studying this and then pondering what we read. Anybody know a preacher named Jim Putterbaugh? Ever heard that name? He was one of my professors. Jim was the kind of teacher that he wasn't all that dynamic in his presentation. Matter of fact, you had to kind of every once in a while. But I'll tell you what, if you wanted to know everything there was to know about a subject, take it from Jim. Because he researched things so thoroughly. And he made the statement one time to us, it's not so much how you read, how much you read the Bible, but how much you ponder what you did read. Just sit and soak in it and let it make connections. In the last few years, I've found connections being made. I'll read something that I've read 500 times, and all of a sudden I have this, epiphany, just, wow, I didn't see that before. That's the way it works. You study it. God will help make the connections. Marty, you want to lead us in a closing prayer, buddy?
Heavenly Father, we thank you for the evening that we've had to come together and to enjoy a meal and enjoy the fellowship with one another and to be encouraged by one another. We're thankful for your word and for the time that we got to spend tonight looking into the history of your people and of your interaction with them and how the people that you have chosen to write your word have done such a skilled job in that. We're thankful for you using people that we might think would be unusable. We're thankful, Lord, that you still work in history and in the history of nations. We pray, Lord, that you will use us to be a light in this nation and salt in this nation, and that we can have an effect towards turning it back towards you. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Anybody remember what nation it was that God said to Abraham, I can't give you the land yet. It's going to be 450 years. I can just imagine Abraham's reaction. 450 years. But what nation was it? He said, they're not yet wicked enough. The iniquity of the the Amorites and the Amalekites. And Agag was an Amalekite. They lived right with